Hello, and welcome to Waterton Glacier Science and History Week 2021. I'm Tara Carolyn, Director of the Crown of the Continent Research Learning Center at Glacier National Park, and I will be moderating today's presentation. Thank you so much for joining us today as we explore results from recent scientific research and conservation efforts in Waterton Glacier International Peace Park. The Peace Park, which is comprised of Waterton Lakes National Park in Alberta, Canada, and Glacier National Park in Montana, USA, was established in 1932 and is the first of its kind in the world, although many others have been modeled after it since then. We want to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that we are on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Siksikaitsitapi, Kootenay, Salish, and Quilispe people, whom we recognize as original stewards of this land and all the relatives within it. We honor with gratitude the people who have cared for this land throughout the generations and continue to maintain enduring connections to their traditional territories. This is our third day of a 4-day webinar series, and we hope you will join us tomorrow for our last presentation highlighting current research and conservation topics related to Waterton Glacier. Every year, dozens of researchers conduct scientific and historical studies here in the heart of the Crown of the Continent, and we're excited to bring some of their latest findings directly to you at your home or office or wherever you might be. Today, we're excited to be featuring the presentation titled Candidate Lynx in Glacier National Park, led by Alissa Anderson. Alissa received her Bachelor of Science degree at the University of Montana and has spent the past 7 years working as a wildlife technician on various projects, mostly in Northwest Montana and Idaho, focusing on monitoring non-game and meso or mid-sized carnivore species. She's now in her third and final year as a master's student at Washington State University. She says when she's not working in the woods looking for critters, she enjoys playing in the woods looking for critters. So it sounds like she's found herself the ideal line of work. Thank you again for joining us today. The presentation will last about 30 minutes and we have about 10 minutes for questions at the end. You can write your questions into the questions box on your screen at any time during the presentation, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we can. If you would like live captioning, watch for the link to be pasted in the chat box. We'll also be sending a survey at the conclusion of this webinar and would love to have your feedbacks as we plan for future events. And now we'll be turning the time over to Alissa. To give you the
All right. You see my screen there?
Yes, we do.
The right one?
Yep, that's the right slide. It's not full screen yet.
Do you now see
I think
the
that
full?
looks good.
Okay. All right, great. Well, thanks, Tara, for the introduction and for the land acknowledgement. All right, just setting up so I can see everything. These webinars, it's always, you can't practice enough. All right, I think that's everything. So yeah, thanks again for having me and thanks everyone for being here. So yeah, I'll be talking today about my graduate research studying lynx and other wildlife in Glacier Park. And this project is a collaboration between Washington State University and the Park Service, and is generously funded by donations to Glacier National Park Conservancy. Yeah, so I'll focus much of the talk on our Canada Lynx research, and then at the end, we'll talk about some of our recreation impacts on wildlife study. So starting off with our Canada Lynx, Lynx is a specialized carnivore, and it's evolved to live in really deep, powdery snow winter environments. So they've evolved these really huge, super furry feet and long legs for their body size. So this is a picture of a lynx foot, and you can't even see its little toe pads like you would on your house cat, right? There's so much fur. And that basically acts like snowshoes and lets lynx float on top of deep, powdery snow environments where people wearing snowshoes are sinking up to their knees. This enables them to catch their primary prey, the snowshoe hare, all winter long in an environment where other predators like bobcat or coyote would just be really floundering. This picture shows the skeleton of a lynx and a hare next to each other, and I think it's a pretty cool demonstration of how both hare and lynx have these similar adaptations for deep snow environments. They both have, for their body size, really long legs and really big feet. So lynx almost exclusively eat snowshoe hare. So we're only really going to find lynx in places where we also have hares. And they're both associated with the boreal forest. So that's our sort of northern conifer forest type of North America. Here's an example of some really nice lynx habitat. I took this picture in Glacier. So we have a really nice old growth canopy cover, and then we've got these younger conifers coming in and lots of down woody debris. And this thicker undergrowth provides lots of places for hares to live and to hide. And these, needles going all the way down to the ground provide food and cover, even as snow levels rise or disappear over the year for hares. So given that, what do you think? How does fire affect lynx and hare habitat, right? So this is kind of gets interesting. As you can imagine, right after a fire, that's not good habitat for a hare or a lynx. There's nothing for them to eat. But about 20 to 30 years after a big fire, there can be this really thick dog hair regenerations of saplings, right? You've all seen this. So this kind of young conifer stand can actually be really good habitat for hares, and that's also for lynx. So for example, of course, much of Waterton burned in 2017 in the Keno fire. And I think it's really cool to think about how in 25 or 30 years, much of that burn area could be really great habitat for lynx. That's kind of exciting to think about down the road. But lynx do still need some older growth forest in order for denning to raise young. So there is worry that in some places with all the mega fires we've been having that all the lynx habitat might burn up and there's not going to be any older refuge habitat for them to live during the 30 or so years it takes for that habitat to come back online. So again, it's a complicated but pretty interesting relationship between lynx and fire. Okay, so we talked about our sort of natural history of our species, and now we'll kind of look at the bigger picture. So the core range for lynx is in Canada and Alaska, and most of the populations in these areas are considered to be doing just fine. However, at the southernmost range edge for lynx in the lower 48, their habitat here is naturally more fragmented. They have naturally lower prey populations. So these populations are just naturally more vulnerable to disturbance of any kind. These populations in the lower 48 were listed as a federally threatened species in 2000. And while not considered in the original listing decision, current evidence shows that climate change is probably one of the greatest threats to lynx persistence in the lower 48. So, how does climate change affect lynx? Well, we already talked about megafires. Obviously that's linked to climate change, but also climate change is likely to decrease snow cover, and the warmer temperatures make snow harder and crustier, right? So, when it's super cold, the snow is really powdery, but then when it's warmer, there's freeze thaw, rain on snow events, you get that kind of hard crust over the snow. Well, lynx are evolved to be specialists in places with lots of deep powdery snow. So in those places, they're the only predator that can really eke out a living in the winter. So this change in snow, can open up areas that are now lynx habitat to more generalist predators like coyote or bobcat that could potentially outcompete lynx. So the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has designated 6 critical habitat units for lynx recovery in the United States, in the lower 48. And we're going to be talking about the Northern Rockies unit, of course. So there are no historic or current population estimates, but the Northern Rockies unit is likely to have the largest lynx population in the lower 48 and likely the best chance of still having lynx at the end of the century, even with expected population contractions due to climate change. About 13% of the Northern Rockies unit is in Glacier National Park. So this is a large protected area within the recovery unit. And furthermore, the east side of Glacier is shown to be likely an important corridor for immigration from source populations in Canada. And this is significant because connectivity with core populations is likely really critical to the continued survival of lynx populations in the lower 48. So we have a large protected area, potentially an important area of connectivity, and we don't really have any baseline distribution knowledge about lynx across Glacier. So this lack of knowledge makes it difficult for biologists to make decisions regarding lynx conservation now, and we won't really know if or when their populations do start to decline because of climate change or any other reason if we don't first have that baseline information. So this project is aiming to fill that knowledge gap and is going to be sort of the first like park-wide distribution survey for lynx across Glacier. We're doing this using trail cameras set up on hiking trails to document lynx presence. So wildlife naturally use human trails just as an easy way to move through the woods, just like us. So by placing cameras on trails, we can gather data on lynx presence without having to trap them or, lure them in or alter their daily lives in any way. Okay, so I'm just wrapping up the third and final field season for this project. So I don't have all my data yet. In fact, I just pulled this picture out of the woods last week, but I'll show you what I got so far from the previous field seasons. So we've detected lynx just about 400 times, and that was at least once on 37% of all the cameras we've had out, and 58% of all the cells. So the cells are those hexagons. Each cell that we survey has 4 cameras. So what can we learn from this data? At the most basic level, we have a snapshot of where we have lynx living and maybe not living right now. And that's great. Now we'll have that baseline information for lynx distribution. But what about where they might live into the future as climate change might begin to impact lynx distribution? That would be really useful to know. So we can think about that, but first we have to look really closely at what the climate and habitat variables look like right now where we are finding lynx. So we can look at climate variables that we think might really be important to lynx, such as snow depth and the places that we're finding them or not finding them, temperature, or habitat variables like canopy cover. So then we can take what we learn about current environmental conditions where we're finding lynx and use that to produce a model for where we predict to find lynx given those certain environmental conditions, right? So then we can use that model to predict where we might find lynx across the entire park. So, there's places in Glacier where there aren't trails, so we're not going to survey those places, but with that model, we can then predict if we're likely to find lynx in those places or not. Okay, so then we've made our little model. We're going to be able to predict where we'll find lynx. And then we can use, instead of our current climate conditions, we can use future predictions for climate conditions. And in that way, we can predict where we might still find lynx into the future given climate change. So I'm going to show you guys an example of what this might look like, okay? A colleague of mine, Travis King at Washington State University, and my advisor sort of developed these survey protocols in a study of lynx in Washington state. So this shows all the locations he had in the Okanagan region. Same thing, he had 4 cameras in every cell. And some places he got lynx, some places he didn't get lynx, same kind of story. And then he used that lynx detection data and environmental conditions to produce a predictive model of lynx occupancy. So that means basically, the probability that lynx will live in a certain place. So that's kind of showing, these burgundy cells are showing to have a really high probability of having lynx right now, given his model. And then the light yellow places, the model says you're probably not going to find lynx if you go look there. So then he used that model for lynx today, but then added, instead used climate data for future climate scenarios, both in the middle of the century and at the end of the century, and in an intermediate and a severe climate warming scenario, right? Because scientists, we think we know what's going to happen with the climate, but of course there's some error. So he found, in Washington by the mid-century that lynx range is likely to become really restricted to just the northern edge. And that by the end of the century, lynx range is likely to be either really restricted or they could potentially blink out altogether from Washington. So I haven't completed that analysis yet for Glacier, but bringing it back, we can think about what that might look like here. This shows the average historic winter temperature for 1970 to 2000. So in Glacier, average winter temperature is roughly between 20 or 0 degrees Fahrenheit or so. And this is showing the predicted average winter temperature by the end of the century in an intermediate and a severe climate warming scenario. So as we might expect, things are likely going to warm up a little bit. Another way of looking at that is this shows the predicted change in average winter temperature. So we're seeing probably either around a 4 to 11 degree warming Fahrenheit. So, that's potentially a pretty big shift in average winter temperatures, certainly enough to really change the snowpack, which we know is important for lynx. So I look forward to getting all my data back and being able to really look at how things might be looking for lynx here. I think it's important to note that, while we do expect climate change is likely going to shift the range that we find lynx in, we don't know for sure how habitat or wildlife are going to respond to climate change. So, one thing that Glacier does have going for it is it has this really big elevational gradient. So it's possible that as the climate changes, habitats that now occur at mid-elevations might expand their range to higher elevations. Dr. McCure talked about that a little bit in Monday's session if you were there. Of course, this would be problematic for our alpine obligate species, right? They're likely to become extirpated, but could provide refuge for species like lynx even into the future. Okay, so I'm gonna move away from our lynx research now and talk about some of our research on recreational impacts on wildlife and how that might affect our wildlife. So, we set our cameras trying to target lynx, but of course they're motion triggered and we pick up all kinds of other wildlife species as well as hikers that are using these trails. Pretty fun to see. So here's a breakdown of the number of detections of our most common carnivore and ungulate species so far. So, we're getting deer and bears sort of as some of our most common species, followed by our larger ungulates and our smallest carnivores, and then our largest carnivores being the least detected species, which makes sense if you think about, the food chain and all that. So, okay, we all know visitation is increasing in Glacier and other national parks. And we have all these wildlife species that are also using our trails. And in some places, we have tons of people, hundreds of people on some of these trails every day. And in other places, we have pretty moderate to light recreational traffic. So we'd like to know, how do wildlife respond to these different kinds of scenarios? Do wildlife completely spatially avoid these places where there are a lot of hikers? Do they maybe not spatially avoid them, but maybe they change their activity and they're only active at nighttime when there aren't people around? So these are important questions because as visitation increases, areas that historically maybe had light recreational use might become high recreational use, right? So we don't know how that necessarily impacts our wildlife across the park, and we'd like to look into that more. So first, we will look at some pretty initial results about how many times our different species were detected at cameras with different recreational intensities. Okay, so here I have the number of detections for a bunch of different species broken up into different categories based on the average number of hikers each day. So each of these categories, these different colored bars for each species, has data from 70 cameras. So the sample size is equal between these different categories, but it does skew towards cameras with fewer people. I am hoping at the end of this summer to have more data from places with more hikers. So on the left then is our number of species detections. So let's look at the hare detections here on the far right. At the highest human use, that red bar being 70 cameras that had on average 700 to 300 people per day, we got 1,500 hare detections. And at that lowest bar, we had 70 cameras between 0.02 and 0.5 humans per day. We got about 600 hare detections. So most of the carnivores are showing kind of a flat or maybe a downward trend towards sites with fewer people. So like our cougar over here, he's showing kind of a flat trend. The cougar isn't really showing any kind of to be detected more or less at places with different levels of human use. It's kind of interesting. But our canids, so our wolf and our coyote, are maybe showing some trend to being more common in places with fewer people. And then on the other side, some of our prey species, so our whitetail and our mule deer and our hare, are all showing some trends of being detected more at places that have more people. So this could be that we're seeing the effect of human shielding behavior. So basically that means where there are more people, maybe there are fewer carnivores, and prey are safer in those places, and they may be hanging out there or being more active in those places. Alternatively, we know that ungulates like to seek out humans for their salts from their urine and their sweat, so maybe that's why they're more frequently detected around more people. Also interesting, we're seeing some of our smallest carnivores, so our marten and our fox, also being more frequently detected perhaps at cameras with more people. Again, this could be some human shielding behavior. So while not sought out as prey necessarily, larger carnivores can still be a danger to smaller, more subordinate carnivores. So I should note that, I don't have all my data back and I haven't looked at if these trends are significant or not, but it's kind of fun to start looking at how things are parsing out, and we'll see how things look at the end. So besides just how often we see different animals, we can also look at what time of day we're detecting our wildlife. So our species being more or less active at night or during the day in these different places with different levels of recreation. So to look at that, we have these activity charts. And for this example, we're going to consider all our cameras that had less than 3 people per day on average as low activity, low human use areas, and all of our cameras that had more than 3 people per day to be high human use areas. And we're going to look at how the wildlife activity changes or not between those 2 different categories. So these activity charts show activity over the day. So on the far left and right, that's midnight. And then in the very middle of the chart, that's noon. So the solid line, that shows human activity. So in both of these cases, you know, humans are mostly active in the middle of the day, hiking out on the trails, right? And our dotted line shows our wildlife activity. And our solid shaded area, the shaded area shows where the activity of the two species overlap. So in this example, we have snowshoe hare, which is a nocturnal species, and you know, their activity does not overlap very much with human activity in either our high or our low human use sites, because they're mostly nocturnal. So it really doesn't change much between the two. So they're mostly active at night and they're not very active during the day. So here's our grizzly bear activity. So in our low human use areas, they are mostly active at dawn and dusk. And then they kind of have some maintained activity also throughout the day a little bit. And then in our high human use areas, grizzly bear, again, they have these sort of dawn and dusk peaks, but they're a little more pronounced. And we're seeing the grizzly bear daytime activity dropping off a little bit. Maybe we're seeing some difference there. It's not super dramatic. Here's the activity chart for lynx. Again, they have a sort of a dawn and dusk peak of activity. And then in the low human use areas, you know, we're seeing some maintained activity throughout the day and kind of a lower activity actually, you know, around midnight. But in the high human use areas, that daytime activity is really dropping off quite a bit. And we're seeing maybe some more activity, you know, during midnight hours, but still having that dawn and dusk peak. So looking like maybe there's some difference here for lynx. This one's pretty fun. This shows our mule deer activity. So in the low use areas, mule deer have this pretty significant activity peak at dawn and dusk, and then really kind of drop off during the afternoon. They take a nap. And in our high human use areas, it's pretty dramatically different. We're seeing mule deer just staying active all day long, and their activity overlaps a lot with human activity. So again, this could be mule deer are using humans as shields from predators, or this could have something to do with mule deer taking salt from humans, you know, while people are out being active on the trails. So that's it for my science. But you know, one of the plus sides to using cameras to do our wildlife research is we also get a lot of really cool pictures, and I think it's fun to show people some of the highlights from the different species we also pick up. So of course, we'll start with a mountain goat since we're talking about Glacier. We get a lot of red fox. This is one of my favorite pictures we've ever gotten. This is a common merganser. They actually nest in cavities, and they can't always find a cavity near a lake. So sometimes they have to hike their newborn chicks on the trail to get to the lake. Elk. A very cool Glacier uncommonly seen species. This is a northern flying squirrel. They are mostly nocturnal, so you don't see them very often, but a bear kindly rearranged this camera for us to be facing this tree so we could get this really great picture. This is a white-tailed deer shedding his velvet. Spruce grouse male, an indomitable force on the trail. Pine marten are also really common across Glacier. The owl chasing a weasel around a stump. I don't know how that turned out. Plenty of wolves and coyote, moose. This is a rare sighting of a breeding pair of Rocky Mountain red monsters. This is a pretty exciting find since they're very elusive. This is an excellent black bear, very healthy. He's doing a good job living his life. A wet bear. This is a cool picture of a lynx chasing a juvenile snowshoe hare. Again, I don't know how that ended. Badger are pretty uncommon in Glacier, but always good to see. Grizzly bears, of course. Porcupine is probably one of the most rare mammal species in Glacier. It's been exciting. We've documented them in a number, I think 14 times now, and kind of spread out across Glacier. So that's been really great to see. Everyone needs to take a good break sometimes while on the trail. Wolverine, of course, also an excellent mammal. This is a sandhill crane and it's juvenile, and some bighorn sheep. So with that, I want to thank everybody at Washington State University and Glacier Park for supporting my graduate research, especially my advisor, Dan Thornton, and co-PI here at Glacier, John Waller. And thanks to everyone who contributes to the Glacier National Park Conservancy for funding this project. And thanks to you all today for coming to this talk and for hosting this webinar series. So with that, if you have questions.
Yes, so we do have a number of questions. We'll see how many, we probably can get to a lot of them, maybe not quite all, but for one really quick question, Ali was asking if you had mentioned a population estimate for the number of lynx in the park. You're on mute, I think. So have we estimated the number, do we have any sort of estimate for the number of lynx in Glacier?
You can hear me now? Yeah, okay. Did my sound cut out quite a while ago during the presentation?
No.
Oh, that's great news. I was worried about it. Okay, sorry. There is not an estimate. No, it's actually, so it's really hard to actually estimate populations of wildlife. It's pretty intensive often. You have to get, you know, like sometimes they'll do it where they'll just collect, you have to collect DNA or mark animals. So we don't really have an estimate for the whole study area or for the Northern Rockies.
Okay, so Dan also asks, he has thoughts and do you have thoughts and conservation concerns about Canada lynx as a target and non-target species in relation to Montana's recent changes to trapping laws?
As far as I know, there's not any additional trapping of lynx. They're still threatened. Certainly, you know, lynx can be non-target captures in certain kinds of traps. I mean, yeah, I don't know all the details on how they plan to respond to if lynx are trapped, but I mean, of course, there's potential for that happening, of course. But.
Okay. Tabitha says, nice talk, Alissa. Can you talk about whether you sampled in winter as well as summer, and if not, the potential influence of that on your results and understanding of climate effects on lynx?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that's, I think, kind of, you know, one of the issues this study, so in Montana, we do have some male lynx. Sometimes we'll go on these walkabouts. It's been documented where they'll leave their breeding area and they'll just kind of like go walk somewhere and then come back. And so I think that does happen sometimes. So it could be that some of the lynx we pick up in summer are not residents. They're not necessarily breeding in that spot. But, you know, I think you have to kind of think too about, especially in places like Glacier where you can't snowmobile, you just can't really very easily survey a lot of these places in the winter, which is, you know, when lynx are most, you know, it's kind of their most important time. But so it's kind of a give and take of being able to survey remote places. But, you know, we might get some guys moving through who aren't living there.
Okay, let's see. Anne also asks, She says, I imagine human trail use may be correlated with other factors that influence animal distribution, such as distance to road, forests versus alpine areas with views. Is there any way to untangle what is the impact of human use? What is the impact of these other factors?
Yeah, so that's kind of one of the things that when we do our occupancy modeling is you can include a lot of different factors. So it's, you know, you're looking at habitat variables and you can look at distance to road, and some of that you can try and kind of pull out with the statistics. But it's a good question. I think it's hard to untangle all the little tiny factors sometimes, for sure.
Okay, let's see. Nicholas asks, do you see evidence on the cameras of breeding throughout the range of where you've detected lynx, or do they seem to only breed in certain areas?
We've only got pictures of kittens one time. In the summer, they're like, when we were first starting to set our cameras out, the kittens are really small and they're not moving around much. And kind of by the end of the time we have our cameras out, you know, kittens might be moving around more with mom. And so I've only gotten pictures of kittens once, but I think that doesn't mean there's not breeding happening in some of those other places, but we just don't know.
Okay. I re-asked, as populations move due to climate change, do individuals move during their lifespan, or do populations slowly move over generations?
It's a good question. You know we did have some males especially that disperse over their lifetimes, but I think it's probably mostly a sort of longer term type change, other than some of those dispersions we have. Okay,
here's an easy one. Lane wants to know if you've seen a lynx in the wild yourself, or mostly via the cameras and such.
Yeah, I've only ever seen lynx that are associated with traps or something like that. I have not seen them, but I know a lot of visitors do get to see them, so it's always exciting.
And Mark wants to know, have you been detecting type and occurrence of any types of illegal use on trails, such as dogs or bikes?
Yeah, we keep track of all that. If we see people with bicycles or dogs, we keep track of that for sure.
Okay, let's see. Got another question from Allie. She says, will the research impact visitation numbers perhaps in the future and require limiting number of visitors entering Glacier, for example?
That's not kind of the main focus of the research. I think that would be, if that were ever to happen, that would be up to, you know, leaders in Glacier to enact that kind of thing. I think it's, you know, it's important to try and understand if humans are having an impact on wildlife, but I don't, you know, we also, one thing is, we don't know necessarily exactly if they are impacting wildlife, you know, how much is that really impacting wildlife survival? You know, some of these species become habituated to people and might interact differently around areas with lots of visitors, which is a different problem.
Okay. And she also wants to know, have badgers always been rare in Glacier?
I actually don't know the answer to that question. That's a good one. I don't know the answer.
So B asks, what are their primary predators? I'm assuming they're talking about lynx.
Yeah, lynx are, I think the one other critter that is likely to kill a lynx is mountain lions. Sometimes will kill lynx. I think that's kind of the big one. I think the most common way for a lynx to die is starvation, actually, during wintertime.
Okay. And our last question is, do you know if there are any plans to continue this study once you finish your degree?
None that I know of. I gotta get through this.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Thanks everyone for all those great questions. We're going to be wrapping up now. We want to thank everyone for joining us today. As a reminder, we're going to send out a short survey and we'd love to have your feedback to help us plan for future events. Thanks to Alissa and our planning and tech team. And be sure to join us tomorrow at noon for a great presentation from Kimberly Pearson, Carly Greer-Stewart, and Joseph Manyfingers on Indigenous-led conservation, restoration, and engagement in Waterton Lakes National Park. We'll see you there and have a great day. Thank you.